I'm John Weisbarth, and I'm a huge fan of the tiny house movement. Tiny house expert Zach Giffen. Trust me, tiny home. Tiny home, tiniest home, tiny. Tiny house, tiny houses, tiny spaces.
Tiny home.
Tiniest house we've ever built.
Tiny house.
Tiny house.
Tiny home.
Tiny home. Tiny house. Tiny house.
Tiny houses. Tiny home. Functional, gadget-filled tiny home. Tiny house.
A tiny home. Yeah. I want to live in a tiny home.
Tiny house.
Tiny house.
Tiny house on wheels. Tiny home. Tiny home. Tiny homes. Tiny house. Tiny house. Tiny home. Tiny living. Tiny home.
Tiny house.
Tiny houses. Tiny refrigerator. Tiny dishwasher.
Tiny home. Tiny home. In
A sustainable micro homestead.
tiny house.
Little Nigerian dwarf goats.
Tiny living. Tiny home. Tiny house. Tiny houses. Tiny house. Tiny house.
Tiny house. Tiny house. See this tiny, it's gonna look like a regular house. It's smaller. Tiny house. Tiny house.
Having a pizza party in a tiny house.
Tiny home.
Tiny home. Tiny home.
Tiny house. And
Tiny house.
Tiny landscapes. Tiny home. This is tiny house. Tiny house technology. Tiny home.
Small living environment. Touch the walls with.
We're building a tiny house. A tiny house?
No.
Wow. It's tiny.
Tiny home.
Tiny house.
It's a tiny house, tiny home, tiny boot camp, tiny house. Tiny house movement.
Tiny home. Tiny Club Francis.
Tiny home, tiny houses, tiny house.
tiny.
Tiny house.
Tiny house.
Tiny house kingdom.
Tiny homeowner.
Tiny house, tiny living, tiniest house.
Tiny home, small space.
This tiny house.
Tiny house. My tiny house, a tiny remote with
Tiny house.